Thank you for inviting me over. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about an exploratory study we did looking at gamblers and venues in New Zealand. Just for those that aren't familiar, I thought the place to start would be to talk a little bit about the New Zealand context and why we're particularly interested in electronic gaming machines. I suspect you are as well, but we know that these continuous forms of gambling where people have repeated fast opportunities to make a wager and get the outcome of that wager are disproportionately associated with harm. So our recent national surveys have shown that about 13% of people who play these continuous products, and EGMs are the key one, are likely to be problem gamblers or moderate risk problem gamblers. And in New Zealand, as I suspect is the case in Australia, the great majority of people who seek help for harmful gambling cite electronic gaming machines as their main form of gambling. And in New Zealand, the largest form of those are the non-casino gaming machines. So in pubs in New Zealand, we have around 18 machines in most pubs. And across years, as you can see on the table there, the number of machines across the country have been declining since 2003, largely because of the Gambling Act, which has given local governments the opportunity to restrict access. And so most local governments have implemented a sinking lid policy where the number of gaming machines has dropped. But that hasn't been paralleled by a drop in help seeking or the prevalence of problem gambling, which is interesting. Here you can see again, this is just help seekers in 2015, I believe. The vast majority cite their main source of problem as non-casino gaming machines. So these machines, of course, are much more easily accessible in that they're in their local communities, whereas casino machines, there are only 5 casinos in New Zealand, and in Auckland, there's just the one, which requires a special trip into the city. Problem gamblers, of course, gamble on multiple forms of gambling, but where they cite their main form, it tends to be non-casino machines, which are easily accessible to them, and of course, you can rapidly lose a relatively significant amount of money. Gaming machines are a relatively recent phenomenon in New Zealand. In the late 1980s, early 1990s, decommissioned machines largely from Sydney were imported in New Zealand by pub owners opportunistic about making a profit. So it was a period of time before the government legislated for their existence, and the first casino was Sky City in Auckland in 1995. So you can see the rapid climb in expenditure in gaming machines and casinos. And despite the machines only being 12 to 18 per venue, 20,000 in the country, and 2-cent machines, we have an extraordinarily large amount of expenditure on non-casino gaming machines throughout New Zealand. Whereas the Racing Board and the Lotteries Commission, which predated all these forms of gambling, their turnover has remained relatively constant. The Lotteries Commission, you can see it increased towards the end, new lotto products coming out, but the weekly lotto draw, we have a second one on Wednesdays, and the scratchy tickets in New Zealand. I'm a behavioural psychologist by training, so my interest in gaming machines started with the notion that these are essentially applications of schedules of reinforcement, which have been identified by behavioural psychologists for a long time. The notion that on average a certain every nth response, or on average every 10th or 20th response, is provided with a reward. In the lab with animals and people, you see a very high consistent rate of responding that is very resistant to any form of intervention, whether that be an aversive or satiation or deprivation. The animals tend to keep responding. And anecdotally, of course, that's what you see in casino and non-casino venues, people sitting in the machine with a very consistent high level of responding that doesn't change much. Of course, the gaming machines are very, very sophisticated compared to those simplistic arrangements. So there's significant or very large variations in reinforcement, the type of reinforcement, the bonus features, additional games, lights, sounds, graphics, all of which tap into these sort of primitive, if you like, biological reward systems that all animals share. And there's other contextual features, multiple games within a game, the bonus features that I've already mentioned, double up buns, double or nothing, loyalty cards with casinos, free parking, status-oriented things like that, and the social context in which gambling occurs. We know from the last 20 years of research that some of the features that gamblers tend to enjoy. Paul Deltabbro, who's in Adelaide, early on did some research and found that regular gamblers were more responsive to what was happening in the machine. Now, that's not to say that this is any sort of rational response, but regular gamblers tend to change their pattern of play more frequently in response to what's happening on the machine. Of course, the machines have a relatively consistent payback, so those variations in responses are not based on anything real. They're superstitious, if you like. Other studies have shown that for people that are experiencing gambling harm, if you reduce the speed of play or you ameliorate the sound somehow, their enjoyment tends to be reduced, the attention reduction reduced. And when you increase the speed and the variety of sounds or the additional reward-oriented features, they have more difficulty in stopping their gambling. So some of those features are related to length of play. And overall, just like the pigeons and the rats in experimental settings, gamblers tend to prefer a steady stream of small, immediate rewards and fast play. So while the jackpot or the big, unlikely outcome is a significant factor in gamblers being there, what they tend to get and what tends to keep them moving with their gambling is the small, frequent wins or losses disguised as wins. It keeps the gambler interested while the illusion or the unlikely reality of the jackpot is present there. Livingston and Woolley have also done a range of qualitative studies with problem gamblers, which we have replicated as part of this bigger project, but we looked also at social gamblers and social, regular and problem gamblers. And what we find and what Livingston and Woolley found is, again, small amounts on maximum lines. So people prefer 1 and 2 set machines that are perceived as good value for money and perceived as safer, but then they tend to cover the maximum number of lines that they can cover. So a 1 set machine turns into 25 or 50 cents per wager, and almost unanimously people cite free spins as the most important feature or one of the most important features, partly because they're perceived as free and partly because they seem to be associated with an increased likelihood of winning. And gamblers tell us that one of the reasons they prefer this maximum coverage of lines is the free spins replicate that pattern of play, so the machines actually encourage them to play in a certain sort of way. In New Zealand, we also have the pop-up message. Australia hasn't implemented this. We're aware of discussions around pre-commitments and so on, but from very early on, the New Zealand government mandated the use of a compulsory pop-up message on all electronic gaming machines throughout New Zealand, regardless of whether they're in casinos or non-casino venues. So these aren't contingent upon any particular game outcomes. They interrupt gamblers at a maximum of 30 minutes of continuous play. At that point, the machine's locked and the display shows the gambler the current session duration, how long they've been sitting there, the money they've put into the machine, and their net position relative to that money put in. And then it simply asks them a simple question: do you wish to continue playing? If the gambler answers yes, 15 seconds later, the machine unlocks and they can continue gambling. If they answer no, the machine immediately pays out their residual credits. If they do nothing, the machine is locked for 30 seconds and then gambling is resumed after that. That last point is one we sort of disagree with. We argue now on the basis of the work we've done that it would be better to require some response from the gambler, or the default response being the cash out and make them start again. The pop-up messages are very simple, not as sophisticated as the machines, so it looks a little bit like an old school DOS message popping up in front of a very sophisticated array of features. These machines in the picture are generic, they're not machines in our venues. But you can see the information is there. There is no message as such, so it's not a pop-up message in reality, it's pop-up information. The idea, of course, is the gamblers can make an informed choice on whether they continue to play. So we were contracted to look at game features and pop-up message across gaming machines and table games. What I'm going to talk largely about here is the in-venue observational study, but I'll touch first on some survey work we did just to illustrate the impact or possible impact of some of the pop-up messages in venues. So our surveys, a Patron survey, we intercepted people as they left casinos and non-casino venues in Christchurch and Auckland and asked them to participate in a study for us. We followed them up a week later over the phone and took the detailed information. The sample was largely, half female, and about 44% were weekly or more gamblers. And this is what we tend to get when we recruit at venues, people that gamble frequently. A level of problem gambling, as you can see in the table there, that is higher than the level in the population. So overall here we have 7% of the sample being problem gamblers, and of the regular gamblers, somewhere around 12%. So we would argue across repeated studies, a representative sample of people that you would find in venues. The majority of these people, about 70 to 75%, cited jackpots and free spins, that slide should say, as the most important or very important characteristics of gaming machines for their enjoyment. Overall, as we'll see on the next slide, pop-up messages didn't impair their enjoyment of gambling. What was interesting was that over half of the gaming machine gamblers, regular and irregular, had seen a pop-up message in the last 3 months. So this means that they had, in the last 3 months, gambled for 30 minutes or more at least. Many of those people, so of the 460 who were gaming machine gamblers, 22% saw them almost every time they played. So regularly they were spending half an hour or more playing the gaming machine. Most of those people saw 1 to 2 pop-ups in a session, some saw 3+. And what's interesting is when we look back to the survey, all of those people that saw 3+, according to the PTSI, were characterised as problem gamblers. And in the survey, not a single person ever reported being approached by a venue staff member in casinos or non-casinos about their gambling. Now, they might have perceived that as a direct approach around gambling, and venue staff may argue that they were having indirect conversations, but the gamblers never perceived that venue staff talked to them about their gambling. What's of interest to us here is that the industry early on argued that the pop-up messages wouldn't be effective and that they would impair the enjoyment of gamblers. And you can see from the data we've got that some people actually thought the pop-up messages were useful in controlling their expenditure. A small proportion perceived the pop-up messages to be factually incorrect. These, in our qualitative work, tended to be people who had experienced a lot of gambling harm and had incorrect beliefs about the level of gambling. And most importantly, the majority were neutral about the impact of the pop-up messages on their enjoyment. There was no great impact on the enjoyment people got out of the gambling, and some people actually found them useful. And this tended to be because they were useful to them in terms of planning their gambling session or controlling their expenditure. This is just a quick summary of some of the outcomes. Now, the surveys are a rather blunt measure, in my opinion. Here it's expenditure over the last 3 months in gambling, and I earlier made the comment, if you asked me what my expenditure on lunches were in the last 3 weeks, I'm not sure I could give you an accurate figure. So I think with these self-report surveys, we always have to take them with a grain of salt. But certainly people that report they were more likely to stop gambling on a visit in response to a pop-up seem to be spending less money on gaming machines. And then some of the softer responses, the more cognitive ones, where they're considering the overall level of gambling or considering reducing gambling, approached significance but weren't significant. So, one of the things we're interested in is how to shift people more from thinking about making a change to actually making a change and considering actually leaving the venue. But overall, the pop-up messages certainly don't seem to spoil anyone's enjoyment. They do break continuous play. They provide an opportunity for gamblers to consider the level at which they're gambling, and they provide an opportunity for venue staff to at least see someone that's been there for a long time, as they're easily visible from quite a distance, and perhaps initiate a conversation when that would be appropriate. The observational study is really what I was brought here to talk about. And experimental studies are always questioned in terms of their generalizability to real-world gambling. They usually involve simulated gambling products or simulated money, so there's questions around that. And the surveys, as I've already touched on, are usually retrospective and self-report. So people are trying to estimate the amount of time or money they've spent gambling over a period of time, and that's inherently difficult in and of itself. Plus, there's motivations to under or overestimate depending on your position. In-venue studies remain relatively rare. Our argument, though, is that it is very useful to go into venues and watch what's going on, because there's a tremendous amount to be learned, both in terms of the way people interact with the gambling products, the way gambling venue staff interact with patrons, and the social context of the gambling and the impacts of other people around and how people interact with each other. Some of the in-venue studies that have been reported have been around discrete trials gambling or discrete event funds. Those are relatively easy to track. So pull tab is the equivalent of what we in New Zealand call scratchies, and I believe something similar here. And Cussick is a dice game where repeated rolls and there's an outcome on every trial. So they're continuous, but they're broken up into relatively discrete events, which makes observational studies easier. Other people like Mark Griffiths in the UK have looked at broad contextual approaches. So sat in a venue for a long time and interpreted or classified groups of people on the go. So you can see on the slide, he came up with 6 broad categories of gamblers. So there was a degree of interpretation or intellectualization as the study went along. Matt Brown in Queensland's done a shadowing study, and this is a really interesting study, but the fundamental issue here is they approached gamblers as they entered venues and asked if they could observe them. So they were explicitly being watched by a researcher and asked to gamble as they would normally gamble. The rationale, and it's a defensible one, was that everyone was affected equally. The real question here is whether people would actually behave as they would normally do, and that's not clear, of course. And then Deltabbro again, 10 years ago, did a study that we liked the look of and we thought we could replicate and extend. He had groups of researchers in venues, sitting at bars, sitting at tables, watching gamblers and making notes, either at the table where they were seated if they could, or immediately on leaving the venue they would make notes on the basis of their recollection of what they saw. We thought this was a more ecologically valid approach than explicitly observing people and letting them know. But we also took advantage of the use of smartphones. If you observe gamblers in venues at any stage, they're often sitting with their phones, texting, checking their emails, doing various things on their phone. So our observers could sit at a machine and gamble and appear relatively normal whilst making notes intermittently on a smartphone. So we staggered the times at which people would enter venues. We would have people entering from 10 a.m. in the morning till 10 p.m. at night and staying in the venue in pairs for 2 hours, making descriptive observations, so accounts of some events, but also qualitative descriptions of what they saw at regular intervals not exceeding 15 minutes. So really as frequently as they could make those notes without being observed, without being detected as observers. They had to gamble, so we got ethical approval both to do this and for the people to gamble. And we decided to gamble as slowly as we could, so a very slow rate of gambling, betting the minimum bet on the minimum number of lines, and then intermittently checking their smartphone and making the observations. Our goals were to simply identify patterns in terms of betting, coverage of lines, pace of play, any changes associated with the gaming machine features that we could see. We focused on the 1 and 2 cent machines. That was largely because they were the most popular ones and they are all that is present in our non-casino venues. So there was always a lot of gamblers there, so we could be relatively obscure in terms of our presence and not be detected terribly easily. And of course, I guess, it's cheaper for us to play 1 cent machines, so our budget would stretch further. 48 hours of observations were conducted, so we had 24 hours each in casinos and pub venues, and we observed over 120 patrons, approximately half in each. We were able to observe for a relatively long period of time. So one single person was followed for 2 hours before they left the venue. We could have gone for longer, presumably, on some of these people, but the longer you observe a single person for, the more likely you are to be detected, of course, and we wanted to avoid that. But we had 8 that we followed for more than an hour. And across the whole study, we were never detected by venue staff. We had permission from venues to be there, but they did not know when or who would be in the venue. So venue staff never thought we were suspicious or checked with us, and gamblers, gave us friendly advice, as this slide illustrates, that the only time we had interactions with gamblers, because we didn't initiate any interactions with gamblers, was when they noticed our pattern of play and they wanted to give us advice on increasing our likelihood of winning. So the one lowest credit bet on a single line was viewed by gamblers, of course, as a silly way to go about gambling. So they were encouraging us to cover more lines because we were more likely to win. We knew up front that this would be very difficult because EGMs, by their very nature, are fast in terms of their movement. And also gamblers, especially when they win relatively large amounts, tend to cash that out and reinsert smaller amounts. So tracking their expenditure is a little bit difficult. Now, the pop-up messages can do that, but it's harder for us to observe it. And of course, in reality, it's pretty hard for the gamblers to track from the amount they put in initially to the amounts they win and then re-bet. So we couldn't track the frequency of small wins, in inverted commas. I want to reiterate here that those wins, in inverted commas, are largely losses. The screenshot I've got here, taken from a Canadian study, illustrates that. That person is covering 15 lines, wagering 75 cents or 75 credits per play. This is signalled as a win to them. They've invested 75 for bet 75 credits and won 25. So in reality, it's a loss. But of course, the machine is telling the person they've won. And strictly speaking, they have won on that one line. But overall, it's not a win. We broke down credits, wins into small wins up to 100 credits, which we simply couldn't count. And most of those are actually losses. If you view the coverage of the lines as a single bet, which we tend to, medium wins, which again, is relatively small amounts of money, and of course, very difficult for us to track. And then the larger wins, 400 plus credits and jackpots and things beyond that. That seemed to be a convenient way of breaking things down for us. The first 2 categories were very, very hard to track. In our focus group work before this study, both gamblers and venue staff told us a lot about how since the pop-ups were introduced, gamblers would actively try and avoid them by swapping machines before the half an hour had elapsed and staying ahead of the pop-ups, if you like, because of the tremendous interruption that they provided to gamblers. We didn't see that at all in casinos or non-casino venues. People tended to sit down at one machine and stay there the entire time they were there. So most gamblers gambled on the one gaming machine, and even on that gaming machine, when there were multiple games to choose from, the majority stayed with the same game. Most of the change we did observe tended to be what we called a foraging type response, which was often at the end of people's visit to the venue, where they might have $10 left and they would move between successive machines and put a small amount of money in, make the maximum bet and go down to zero very quickly, perhaps as a last sort of attempt to get lucky before they left the venue. We never saw anyone win a large amount using that approach, so it's an open question as to whether if they had struck a large win, whether they would have continued with their visit to the venue or left. So I guess as expected, as a behavioural psychologist by training, I would expect a relatively high rate of responding, very consistent, relatively little change. And overall, that's what we see, and people that work in venues see this all the time as well. The qualitative descriptions were just people's notes, as detailed as they could make, linking gambler behaviour to the events they were seeing. And what we saw here again was relatively little variation. So these very small wins seem to give people momentum, and that they keep people interested and they keep people playing. All the signals from the machine are that these are wins. Of course, the reality is that they're not. but we see little variation in people's responses to that. The only audible and visible signs of any change in player behaviour or player disposition is the sort of stuff described in the bottom half here. Sometimes subtle indications of disappointment, an ongoing building, perhaps frustration that nothing meaningful to the gambler is happening, that they're essentially losing at a relatively slow rate and becoming slightly disenchanted with what's going on. With the medium credit wins, a large amount of this again was relatively invariant, but where we saw a lot more variation was where these medium credit wins were associated with some of the game features, the bonus features, largely the free spins. That's where things become a lot more animated, in that there are more interactions with other gamblers. As this first description suggests, often we saw winning a dolphin feature, which was a free spin type feature. The animations are playing, people sit back and watch what's happening, and maybe also win during the free spins later on. So there was more interaction between gamblers and interactions with the machines, more obvious signs of enjoyment. Overall, most of the physical signs from gamblers aren't around having fun or enjoyment. They're just a relatively consistent pattern of play with a somewhat depressed look, I guess, is a way of describing it. Not happy places. But the bonus features tended to engender that sort of more positive response. So as the 300 credit win quote there illustrates, smiling to people next to it, getting smiles back, the feature wins drew attention from other gamblers. So there was, in addition to the machine providing some reward, there was evidence of some sort of social reinforcement as well. And people showing obvious signs of excitement, so jiggling in their chair, watching the screen, a sort of pause where they're not actively making new bets, they're watching what's going on and perhaps enjoying a little bit more. The larger wins, as I've already mentioned, a common response here was to cash out, maybe not immediately after the win, but in a period of time soon after. But that's not really cashing out and leaving and ceasing gambling. It was cashing out, and gradually reinserting amounts of money. So perhaps giving themselves some feeling that they were in control of what was going on by withdrawing their winnings, but then gradually re-wagering those winnings across time as the machine, of course, slowly resulted in losing. In the casinos, where we observed frequently social groups, so sometimes these were elderly people. This was in the Christchurch casino not long after the earthquake. There were very few other opportunities to engage in social activities in Christchurch. The casino was one of the few businesses in the central business district that wasn't affected. But we often, or not often, frequently saw groups of people where they did have a relatively large win. They would share the cash amongst each other and continue gambling. So there was a communal sort of coordinated group activity there. We didn't see that in pubs, but in pubs we did see more communication between gamblers, discussion about jackpots nearing limits and things like that, but not this sort of ongoing social activity. So these were probably groups of people that had made a special trip to the casino and perhaps had scheduled 3 or 4 hours to gamble. So if someone happened to win $50, they might share it between each other to enable everyone to continue with their social activity. With these larger wins, we also saw more pausing and more variation. So after a win, people would increase their rate of betting or decrease it or reduce the coverage or increase the coverage. And I think this was a very individualistic type thing. So some history of gambling had probably led them to this, but there was a lot more variation in gambling after a win. So I expect some people perceive the machine as less likely to pay out again after a relatively large win, and some people perceived it as more likely. Some people changed machines after those sorts of wins as well. So while a lot of people cashed out, almost everyone continued to gamble. One person was observed cashing out and leaving the gambling area. Again, they had lost some of those winnings after that, but they did seem to walk out with cash that they would, withdrawn from the machine. Some people increased their betting and some people played on the same rate or relatively little change. But this was the one place where we saw variation. We saw variation when a relatively significant amount of money was won. And I just need to reiterate, we can't easily track someone's financial position, and I expect gamblers can't either, because the losses and the wins become confused with each other. I imagine they know what amount of money they've taken into the casino or the non-casino, and what they tend to leave with in all their observations was nothing. They didn't tend to take winnings away. So they gradually, reduced their gambling to zero. At various stages, they might have had a net win if they sit there for long enough, but very few people, well, we didn't observe anyone leaving with an obvious increased amount of money. These are just examples of the sorts of things going on with the free spin type features. So this is another example where we see variation in betting, obvious signs of enjoyment, social interaction with other people noticing them with the bonus features, wins associated with the bonus features, and this person, won $100, cashed out 90, reinserted some of that money, ended up leaving with about $90 here, had 3,000 credits in the machine to start with, so overall is losing money, but in their mind probably had a good afternoon. Same sort of quotes here, obvious signs of enjoyment, obvious pausing. Again, it's difficult to know when the right time to approach someone or when the right time to provide someone with information is. But with the large wins, there is a variation in activity and mood is obviously elevated. But of course, many people perceive themselves as being on a lucky streak. So, they may not be receptive to advice here either. But a lot more variation, a lot more pausing, a lot more interactions with other people, chatting, admiring each other's activity, and so on. The last quote here, of course, shows variations in bet amount. So immediately after a win, increasing the number of credits, number of lines, then decreasing it, linked to some of the events, but not in any sort of rational way. And of course, the probability of winning is unchanged across time. So although they may think they're having an effect on the machine's behaviour, they're not. Free spins really came out as the most interesting feature for us, and one that we think should be the focus of more harm minimisation efforts. Unlike the jackpot, these are things that are achievable, and people that are gambling for long sessions do win. They are perceived as free, they are perceived as a bonus, they seem to encourage people to bet maximum lines and play in a particular sort of way. They also provide pauses, which is not a bad thing, but they're filling those pauses with graphic features, music features, win-related stuff, which probably increases the excitement and certainly draws the attention of other gamblers. So there's multiple sources of reward or reinforcement going on here. We saw a lot of expressions of relief, like people hope to win the jackpot, but they expect to win free spins. So it's a realistic goal for them, and then the free spins give them, in their minds, because they're free, of course, additional chances to win a jackpot. So they look to us like a feature that encourages excessive gambling, gives an unrealistic perspective on winning larger amounts, but facilitate an increasingly harmful pattern of play and a social facilitation of gambling that some of the other features don't. So they are an interesting feature, and one that we think should be the focus of more research and should be the focus of more interventions around gambling harm. We weren't fortunate enough in our 48 hours of observations to see any significant jackpots being won. But we did see differences across pubs and casinos. In pubs, which, as the discussions of today have made clear to me, our pubs have a maximum of 18 machines, so they tend to be smaller gambling venues than pubs in the Melbourne area. But across Australia, I suspect there are differences there. So there is a communal aspect, and people are talking about jackpot amounts and the jackpot limits and when they're getting near to their limits. And so at the bar and in the gaming venue, they're actively monitoring the jackpot limit and when it's likely to go off. And as the jackpot limits approached, we saw more and more people making brief visits to the gambling areas, which are usually separate from the bar, and putting a relatively small amount, $20 into a machine, and playing that amount down very quickly at the maximum number of lines they can until no credits remain. And a deliberate sort of, again, foraging type expedition to try and win the jackpot. But that resulted in 20 to 30 minutes of gambling because of those small features along the way. So while the jackpot, we never saw it being won, these people were being exposed to lots of small wins and features that may well encourage them to gamble for longer in the longer run. We didn't see this sort of activity in the casinos. The casinos are social and that there are lots of people there, but they don't have the same sort of community feel as the non-casino venues, except when people are there, as per the example a few slides back, with a group of friends, perhaps from a retirement village, where they're spending an afternoon gambling together. So examples of the sorts of discussions people were having, discussing what game is the one that's most likely to result in winning the jackpot, keeping track of the amount that the limit is and where it's at. So, $940 is creating some excitement, and this goes through the whole bar. So people are gravitating towards the gambling area and taking opportunities to gamble around, they're not spending the whole 4 hours of the evening in the bar, but they'll come in for a brief period of time on the off chance that they might win the jackpot. The pop-up messages, we saw lots of them across our observations. The only time we detected any disgruntlement or any impact on people's pleasure in terms of their gambling was when the pop-up message came up when gamblers perceived the jackpot was likely to go off. So in this case, the jackpot was near its limit and this woman's gambling was interrupted by a pop-up message at that time, and she perceived that, she made a disparaging comment about the purpose of the pop-up message, but she perceived it as deliberately interrupting her opportunity to win the jackpot. And that elicited some sympathy from other gamblers in the room. In terms of the EGM events we were able to observe, as you'll see, we never saw a jackpot being won, but we saw 3 minor jackpots being won. So these are relatively small amounts, I guess, $50 to $200, twice at a casino, once in a non-casino venue. We never saw a full jackpot going off despite, trying hard. And our players, of course, our observers never won a jackpot. But the interesting thing here is, in relation to the other features, the pop-up messages, we saw about 20 observations in each venue type. In comparison to free spins and relatively large credit wins, these were relatively rare events. So they're not occurring at a frequency that is going to disrupt people's gambling in an ongoing sort of way. And relative to most of the meaningful events at a gaming machine level, they occur relatively infrequently. In terms of people's immediate responses, we never saw people, seeing a pop-up message and suddenly having an epiphany that they gambled too much and they should leave. But we did see that people seemed to be attending to either what was going on in their screen or took it as an opportunity to have a look at what other gamblers were seeing. The only time we saw frustration was when jackpots were nearing their limits. And that was equally across both venue type, and the comments or the obvious signs seem to be linked to the jackpot being likely to go off. After the pop-up message, the pop-up messages occurred at a rate that was easy for us to track, and we were we and the Ministry of Health were very interested in the impact of pop-up messages, both in terms of people's enjoyment, but more importantly in terms of whether they were resulting in any tangible harm reduction. Now, I think our survey showed that perhaps they are in a relatively small way. In terms of the observations, we didn't see much evidence. Most people, or at least half, continued playing the same sort of way. Some upregulated or downregulated their gambling or shifted machines, but for the most part, the overwhelming response was business as normal, continuing with the same pattern of gambling. One person you'll see in the casino at the bottom there checked the voluntary display afterwards. Now, that seems to indicate that they wanted to confirm that the position was where they thought they were at. And in our qualitative work, people that had sought help for their gambling, 3 of the 20, which is not a large percentage, but 3 of the 20 voluntarily cited the pop-up messages as a factor in their help seeking, something that spurred them towards considering their level of gambling and seeking help. So they don't seem to be a silver bullet that fixes problems, but they're part of a range of interventions that push people towards hopefully seeking support or considering more closely their gambling behaviour. So on the pop-up messages, which won't be introduced in Australia, but were introduced very early in New Zealand, the problem is, on the basis of our research and our interpretation of what's going on, the gambler's not actually required to make a decision. They can just wait and things resume as normal. Because our government took the opportunity to introduce these very early, some of the research since has added greater understanding of how these might be more effective. So linking the jackpots to gambler-determined limits, asking them questions about their intended expenditure, what their budget is, and then tying the pop-up message to that later on. So if they say they're happy to spend $50 gambling, then when they approach $40 expenditure, the pop-up message might come up and remind them of their limit, or asking them questions about their gambling along the way. And sometimes more emotive comment around family disruption and loss of money. These things seem to add a layer of effectiveness above and beyond our relatively passive method of information provision. The messages in New Zealand are also only contingent upon the passage of time, so they come up after 30 minutes. And it's an interesting issue for research and for practitioners, people working in venues, when gamblers are most receptive to advice or most open to discussion. Some evidence suggests, either winning or losing, but the random time is not terribly effective. But gamblers are going to vary. And having talked to some of the people that work in venue support areas here, it's not only the timing of the discussion, but it's the nature of the discussion and how you initiate discussions generally, and it might be more broadly than specifically around gambling. But disappointingly, what we did find was no evidence of venue staff engaging with gamblers as they were gambling. So we didn't see any evidence of venue staff approaching gamblers, and gamblers in our survey, 500 of them, reported never having a discussion with a venue staff member about their gambling. Now, it may be that some of these discussions are more general about well-being, but there's a disconnect between, as this poster shows, the responsibility in New Zealand of venue staff and gamblers' perceptions of what's going on. We've argued to the Ministry of Health, and they're considering it, that perhaps, if someone sees successive pop-up messages, by the second or third one, a gambling venue staff member may have to unlock the machine, or at least there may have to be a conversation about how things are going on. Some, more a push towards a more deliberate choice to continue gambling and consideration of some of the information. Whether messages should be presented after a series of losses or after a win isn't clear. Some research suggests that after a series of losses is the appropriate place. But of course, if in the absence of these electronic messages, approaching someone after a series of losses presents, its unique challenges. And when we've tried experimental studies in New Zealand at the moment with passive provision of just information, it doesn't seem to matter when that's presented. It's not terribly effective regardless of when it's presented. So a more direct message contacting either cognitive or emotional mechanisms is probably more useful. And it's still not clear when the best time to present that message is. Any change requires cost, but in an ideal world, it would be useful to introduce something that requires some cognitive effort, making contact with preset limits or something of that nature. And in the venue, where people see multiple pop-up messages, in reality, they've been gambling at a machine for 45 minutes, an hour and a half. They are much more likely to be problem gamblers. In our survey, anyone that reported seeing 3 messages regularly was a problem gambler. There's probably, in New Zealand, regulations, an obligation on people in the venues to talk to those gamblers. The pop-up messages are easy to see, and this is a big advantage of them. Even if the gambler's not paying attention to the information, the machine is obviously locked, so people in the venue can see it. Whether they approach the gambler there and then, they should be aware of multiple pop-up messages with the same gambler, and they claim to know their clients relatively well. And, my thinking on this is if I walked into a pub and didn't order a meal or any drink and sat there for 45 minutes to an hour, a venue staff member would approach me. So, there is an obligation on them to approach people in the gambling area. The casinos claim they do this already, have a lot of host responsibility material available, but both from our study and our survey, and when our Department of Internal Affairs did a mystery shopper campaign, nobody has been able to find any tangible evidence of people being approached by venue staff member. I think the Internal Affairs sent people in who gambled for 3 or 4 hours non-stop, and they were not approached, and that made the New Zealand media, and it was quite controversial and a difficult situation for the casinos to deal with. On the game features, which is probably what you're more interested in here, it's pretty clear to us from all the work we've done that all the features are important. The small wins, or wins disguised as losses, are important not because gamblers value them in any sort of way, but they keep behaviour moving. The machines are providing win-related sounds and jingles and graphics that encourage the gambler to keep moving. So this is contacting very basic behavioural work. Pavlov's dogs, those sounds are associated with wins. Even if the reality is it isn't a win, it is encouraging people subtly to keep moving. The jackpots are displayed, of course, so that is kept alive. The larger wins and bonus features, not the jackpots, but the free spins and medium level wins of 300 plus credits or up to $100 or so, aren't life-changing events. They aren't the holy grail for the gamblers, but they are things that if you gamble for long enough are achievable and create an excitement and draw attention from other gamblers in the venue. So they are things that gamblers, if they gamble for long enough, realistically expect to win. The issue for us is whether the free spins result in the ongoing free wins a higher probability of winning. Now, an Australian researcher, Matt Rockloff, has argued that they seem to. We don't know whether the machines explicitly arrange that, but from our observations, we saw a lot of people winning relatively substantial wins in the free spins. So it looks to us like that's the case. Gamblers tell us that that seems to be the case. So even if it's not reality, it looks that way. So if it looks that way to us and we're trying to be objective, to a gambler, it's very much going to see that way. So I think, at least in terms of game regulators and manufacturers, we need to hopefully be very clear that that's not the case. And whilst removing free spins would annoy gamblers, I think it would also result in a reduction in gambling intensity. Jackpots were the only feature that we saw that was associated with stopping gambling. Not stopping gambling immediately, but it seemed to encourage people to cash out, reinvest smaller amounts and try and walk away with some money. And of course, in the survey, and as anyone knows who talks to gamblers, jackpots are a big enticement. But in and of themselves, people don't tend to win them very much, of course, because the house makes a profit. So they're only harmful in terms of their, I don't know if I phrased that correctly, but they encourage people to keep gambling. So it's the possibility that people might win the jackpot. But overall, of course, what we saw was what we expected, a relatively consistent invariant pattern of gambling. But the two things that I would like people, would like to focus on really are the free spins, which create a lot of potentially problematic behaviours on a number of levels for the gambler, for the people in the room, and the losses disguised as wins. Strictly speaking, of course, if you wager on 20 lines and one wins, you've won on that line. But the reality for the gambler is they haven't won, and clarifying that would be useful. In venues, looking for variations in behaviour is really key. So it's not just signs of frustration, aggression, which are obvious signs that someone is experiencing harm, but patterns of responding, where people are going into stereotypical upregulating, downregulating. Variation seems to imply that someone thinks they know something that they don't. And behaviour specifically around jackpots and in crowds. We haven't managed to do it yet, but what we'd like to use this procedure for is to look at quiet gambling settings versus ones that are where the machines are highly occupied and there's more going on, and seeing if that sort of social setting is associated with increased gambling. We suspect it is. The bigger wins in the jackpots tend to be associated with more pausing, more cashing out, and sometimes walking away, at least briefly, from the machines. So perhaps at least, gentle discussions around gambling at that particular point might be useful. We think this procedure is really interesting. Once it got published, people have been contacting us frequently about how interesting it is, because you can use it to collect relatively detailed quantitative type information, or you can use it to collect descriptive qualitative accounts. But even beyond that, it's something we can all do just in terms of learning more about how gamblers are behaving in venues. So as researchers or students in the areas, often we're not active gamblers ourselves. I certainly don't have a history of gambling. So going into the venues and watching closely what was going on was a really important learning experience for many of us. Practitioners, policymakers, you get an understanding of some of the nuances of gambler behaviour and some of the more contextual stuff that goes on. It's not all about the link between the gambler and the machine. There's a lot of social stuff going on as well. So we think, although, as a scientist, some of this information is not as robust as we would like, it adds to the picture of some of the experimental data, the survey-related data, the other data we've collected from different sources that are lacking some of this more grounded material, if you like. Hindsight's always 20/20, and we went into these venues trying to observe too much. I think what we need to do is focus on a couple of features and just look at them. The pop-ups were easiest for us, but the free spins are an obvious one that we want to look at in more depth. And the jackpot. And with the jackpot, it's more the contextual stuff, people's discussions, the increasing activity as jackpots near their limits, and whether that's related to more intensive gambling or whether it's just the social activity. We don't really know this. You can tailor the approach to taking more qualitative, contextualized, descriptive sorts of accounts at an individual level or at a group level. We can look at specific sorts of gamblers. It can be used in any sort of way. The scientists amongst us might want longer and more robust observations, inter-rater reliability, two people watching the same gambler and making sure that we're scoring things in the same sort of way. Our problem with that is we want it to be anonymous. So if we send people in and they're both watching the same gambler, that tends to be, well, it starts to look creepy, obviously. People can see that they're being watched if they're being watched by multiple people. Controls, looking at equivalent periods. More and more we're drawn towards the more descriptive accounts of what's going on. We think that there are things to learn there. Some scientists are less satisfied with those sort of accounts, but I think they can provide some unique insights into how people gamble in venues, how the social context impacts on them. And if we were lucky enough to see some interactions between venue staff and gamblers, we could probably have anonymously observed that and provided descriptive accounts, and I think those would be useful. When we talk to venue staff and to gamblers, they have a unique perspective on how these interactions go, and sometimes having an independent observer might be useful, as we can see things from a relatively dispassionate perspective, I guess. Lastly, I think, either formally or informally, I think this is a useful thing to do, but both for people that are working with venue staff and people that aren't. Getting into venues and watching closely what's going on, and you can make notes on a smartphone unobtrusively, just for your own benefit, not to make judgments on people in the venues, but to learn about how things operate. And I think that was very useful to a range of us. And for us, it's posed more questions about what we might do in the future. But we've also learned a lot. And I think, observing people as they behave, we talk about ecological validity here, not interrupting what's going on, but trying to document it and understand it later on, is a very useful thing to do. And it certainly adds to experimental studies, which always suffer in terms of trying to generalize them outside of the laboratory. And the surveys, again, are invaluable, and our Patron survey was really useful. But if you're asking people to comment on what they've done over the last 3 months, there's always an amount of error built into those sorts of things. A little plug for our government, who I think were very bold in terms of introducing the pop-up messages. They haven't fixed the problem, of course, but I think they have added something that is helpful for some people. They haven't impacted on enjoyment, and of course the gambling industry is still doing quite well out of this, but they do provide a reality check for some people, especially people who are early into their gambling career. Sometimes it can be a shock for people to see how much they've actually lost or how long they've been there. It would be good if they actually provided a message as opposed to just information. And of course, people developing these games are always 6 steps ahead of us. So there is a lag between the technologies. And as people working in the sector, that's just something we all face, that we don't have the resources and the money of the game designers or the venue operators. Thank you so much for your interest in this project. If you want to see the papers or see more accounts of it, you can go to our website, and there's my email address there. Don't hesitate to contact us. We're very interested in people either using this approach to conduct research or working with people to try and get this research done more. It would be interesting to look at pub venues in Australia versus pub venues in New Zealand. From the discussions I've had today, these are quite different sorts of venues, and how those might impact on gambler behaviour and the social activities going on in the pubs would be very interesting. Thank you for your time.